It's 22 minutes to 5 and we finally got through. I've got Dr. Ron Neller on the phone from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon, Dr. Ron.
Good afternoon, Mick. How are you?
I'm fantastic. And look, it's nice to know that you could hear me over the phone before, but sadly the studio couldn't hear you. But it's great to have you back on the line again. And of course, it's been a few weeks since we spoke to you last.
It has almost a couple of months, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, look, Dr. Ron, of course, is has a bachelor honours PhD in geomorphology, and happy to answer any questions that you might send through. Send them through to our text line 0401 949 949. Now, of course, every week we speak with somebody from Creation Ministries, and we talk about, well, sometimes the recent news, or maybe creation, evolution, even aliens and dinosaurs we've talked about. And Dr. Ron, I sent a clipping through to you this week in regards to a story that came out in a whole lot of different newspapers and publications across the planet that had a headline, "Proof Bible Story is Real."
Yes. Interesting title, that one is. It's a title where there's an assumption that it's not real.
Yes.
Which is, I looked at the title when you sent it through and I laughed and I thought, oh, how many times have we got to prove to you the Bible is real for you to accept it?
Yeah, but the fact that this has come out in a whole lot of very non-Christian newspapers is still kind of cool. It's certainly going to open people's minds.
Yes, indeed. In fact, the idea that it does match the Bible is because they've actually refined their techniques in science to look at it a little bit more deeply. They were using their techniques a little bit off track, just let's put it that way to start with. But no, it's a great story.
Yes, well, of course, the story's based on the premise that prior to this story, they didn't believe it was real because of other science that they've sort of said, it's not real because of. And now all of a sudden they've sort of changed their tune.
Correct. They were looking at a piece of wall in Jerusalem, part of the old wall, that they thought that Hezekiah had actually built that wall, when in fact it was his great-grandfather, King Uzziah, who actually built the wall. And so they were out by quite a couple of hundred years, I would say. But that's been accepted. The latter date was accepted all along when it was in fact the earlier date. And that earlier date, as you've shown by sending that article through, actually matches with the book of Amos, where it says that King Uzziah actually did that. And so now they can finally accept that. Interesting. But they actually, just a bit of background there, they did use carbon-14 dating originally, but carbon-14 dating is at times quite unreliable, and particularly during that period when the isotope was quite fluctuating. So what they did this time was connect it to some tree rings, what we call dendrochronology, and together, working through both of them, managed to come to a different date, which now matches the Bible. So they've refined their techniques a little bit, using more scientific techniques, if you like, looking at how they match each other, and actually this time agreeing with the Bible, not with an earlier interpretation. So quite exciting.
Yes, it is exciting. And not only that, they're actually using science. These things that they're using now can actually pretty closely and reasonably accurately measure real dates, as opposed to when they say they've come up with something that was like 1 million years old. What sort of instrument do they use then?
Oh, they use a variety of instruments, and I've played with various techniques myself when I was a professor in academia and so on. I played with optically stimulated luminescence, potassium argon dating, radiocarbon dating, carbon-14 dating. Played with all of those. They're actually quite, I'll be honest, they're quite unreliable. And as an academic, I did not rely on them with any real confidence. The carbon-14 dating technique can be quite accurate in more recent times, since the global flood. And when we can match that to pottery, where we know the date of the pottery by it's got a date on it, we can refine that technique. So that carbon-14 can be quite useful in examples like this, when we're talking about a rock wall that was built in Jerusalem, or pottery. But most of the other techniques, I'll be quite honest, I gave up using them as an academic because I did not rely on them at all.
Now, that's interesting. We've heard other people talk about, how it's not particularly accurate, but we're now hearing this from Dr. Ron Neller, a PhD in geomorphology. It's the sort of tool that, had you not been a Christian or believed in the dates that you do believe in, it's the sort of tool that you would actually use.
They were tools that I used in the early part of my career. And of course, not being a Christian, I accepted them as scientific. I accepted them as reasonably accurate. But I found that if you have multiple samples from, let's say, one layer in a rock or in sediment, if you have multiple samples and send them off, you can actually get quite diverse dates from those same or samples that lie next to each other at the same level in the rock. And I began to become quite confused about that. How can, at one level in a rock layer, can you then argue that these different samples taken all give you different dates? Well, which one is correct? Which one do I publish in a journal? And it came down in the end, I'm afraid to say that for many academics, you publish the one that agrees with your way of thinking.
How different are you talking?
Ones. Oh, they can be, particularly with carbon-14, they can be thousands of years, particularly if you're in the, let's say if you go beyond 4,000 years, you're getting, I don't think you can date beyond 4,000 years, but they claim you can date up to 30, 40,000 years. But even in the modern period, even to say 2,000 years ago, you've got to be very careful with it and correlate it with other evidence as well to get a much more refined date. But I found myself, in terms of interpretation, I found myself not relying on the dates to help me interpret what I was seeing or what I was studying, because those radiometric dates were not reliable to me. And so I had to use other techniques, particularly structural features or features to do with the rock itself. I really did, I just sort of gave up on some of those advanced techniques as being unreliable.
In the past, we've sort of heard about how this carbon-14 dating works and how it sort of breaks down over time. It sort of has a half-life, and so you can extrapolate a date from that. And as you're saying, once you get to just a few thousand years, it starts getting fairly inaccurate, and once you're at tens of thousands, it's really difficult. But then so often we hear about things that are millions of years old. Sometimes we even hear about things that are billions of years old. What do they use to get those numbers?
Well, they are using, similar to carbon-14, which is using radioisotopes. They're using simply different radiometric techniques, they're called. So they're all using the same sort of foundational techniques, using radioisotopes of different types and so on. I think the biggest problem we have is we know that each of them has a half-life. Now, you mentioned that with carbon-14. The half-life there, in other words, is 5,730 years, roughly. So what we can say is that half of carbon-14 has already gone through a transformation in 5,730 years. So it becomes more difficult to detect it the longer the period of time. Now, we assume that rate of decay is linear, that it's a constant rate of decay. That is one major assumption. There's no real proof of that. We know that carbon-14 has been affected by even industrial activity, the presence of organic material in the soil. All of these things can alter that rate of decay. So you're actually not measuring, by the way, just to be clear, you're not actually measuring the date of the substance you're looking at. What you're doing is you're getting a set of other information that you interpret a date from. And so this radiometric dating, where you're looking at decay rates and so on, one, they're not constant, and secondly, you're not actually dating the product itself. You're interpreting it from this decay rate. Sounds a bit scientific, but the point is we don't have proof that these decay rates are constant. They'll argue that, but it's not been proven with certainty or anything like that. So, as I said, I would send off multiple samples from one layer. I could get back considerably different dates.
Yeah.
And which one am I going to use? And I mean, they are significantly different. They can, if it's more recent, it could be hundreds of years out. And that's exactly what happened in this case here. In the walls of Jerusalem, they were hundreds of years out. Therefore, they were saying, well, therefore, it wasn't Uzziah who actually built the wall, and therefore the Bible is wrong. When in fact, their technique has errors of that magnitude, and that's how they made the mistake.
Well, at least now they've righted it.
Correctly. Which is, I mean, the fascinating thing is I think there's a, how would you put it? Even if we don't have archaeological evidence, as we do here in the wall or pottery or so on, I think we have to be cautious about apparent conflict between archaeology and the Bible. Yeah. I don't think we should water down or waver our Christian convictions at all.
Yeah,
it really does reflect poor science, to be honest. And I love science, but in this area, I'm not confident with these dating techniques.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ron, unfortunately, our time's come to an end. It's been such a short week this week, but it was awesome speaking with you again. And, of course, particularly about this and knowing that, they've used some dating techniques to actually prove the Bible was correct in this particular case, particularly after not that long ago they tried to disprove it using similar techniques. Now they've gone, no, actually, the headline, Proof Bible Story is Real. Oh, that's beautiful, isn't it?
It is. It's fascinating, too, how they rely so much upon the scientific technique.
Yes.
Yet the Bible sits in front of us and has been proven over and over again to be correct, yet they will still challenge even the smallest points.
Absolutely.
Of a couple hundred years difference in a wall, when it's so clear in the Bible, when it actually states when the wall was built.
Yes.
They rely so much on science.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ron Neller, thank you so much for another week. It's been a pleasure having you.
My pleasure, Mick.